The tall crystal towers reached up into the purple sky of Zentara Prime, where 3 suns burned bright and hot above the great council building where representatives from 100 different worlds gathered to make decisions that affected billions of living beings across the galaxy, and among them stood Captain Jake Morrison from Earth with his hands clasped behind his back, in the formal military stance he had learned years ago during his training at the academy, back home where the sky was blue and there was only 1 sun and 1 moon, and where he sometimes wished he could return, but duty called him here to this place where he now stood accused of crimes he did not commit and faced the anger of beings who had lived for centuries, before humans even learned to build rockets and leave their home planet. He stood in the center of a circular chamber, carved from some kind of glowing stone that seemed to pulse with its own internal light, and the ceiling stretched so high above him that he could barely see the top, where ancient murals depicted the founding of the Galactic Court 3,000 years ago, when the first species came together and agreed to settle their differences through words instead of weapons, though Jake was beginning to wonder if words could be just as dangerous as any laser rifle or plasma cannon when wielded by someone with enough power and enough hate in their heart. And right now, the being who wielded the most dangerous words in this chamber was Lord Chancellor Vexthor, who stood on a raised platform 20 feet above the floor and glared down at Jake with eyes that burned with barely concealed contempt. Vexthor belonged to the Zentaran species who had ruled this sector of space for 300 years before humans ever left Earth, and his body was covered in scales that shimmered between green and gold in the light from the 3 suns that streamed through the transparent dome overhead, and his tail was thick and powerful, and when he was angry it would slam against the floor with a sound like thunder. And right now he was very angry indeed because Jake had survived an encounter with a Krell warship and lived to tell about it, which apparently was not part of whatever plan Vexthor had been working on for reasons Jake did not yet understand, but was beginning to suspect had nothing to do with justice, and everything to do with politics and power, and the desire to keep humans in their place as the newest and least respected members of this ancient organization. 3 weeks ago, Jake had been on routine patrol along the border between Council space and the territories claimed by the Krell Empire, which was not officially at war with the Council, but was not exactly at peace either, and there had been incidents before where ships from both sides had exchanged fire and harsh words and threats, and so far the diplomats had managed to keep things from exploding into full-scale war. But everyone knew it was only a matter of time before something happened that could not be smoothed over with careful language and trade agreements, and Jake had hoped that day would not come during his patrol. But fate had other plans, and when his sensors detected a Krell warship moving through what was supposed to be neutral space, he did exactly what his training and the Council regulations required him to do. He had hailed the Krell ship on all standard frequencies and identified himself as a Council patrol vessel and requested that they state their business in neutral territory, and he had been polite and professional and had followed every single rule in the book, because Jake knew that humans were still on probation in the eyes of many Council members who thought Earth had been admitted too soon, and who were just waiting for any excuse to say that humans were too violent and too unpredictable and too primitive to be trusted with the responsibilities of membership in the Galactic Court. And so Jake was always extra careful to do everything by the book and to never give anyone a reason to question his conduct or his judgment. But the Krell ship had not responded to his hails, and instead it had powered up its weapons and locked targeting sensors onto his vessel, and Jake had raised shields and attempted to retreat while continuing to broadcast messages asking the Krell to stand down and explain their hostile actions, and he had even transmitted his full identification codes to prove he was a legitimate Council vessel and not some pirate or smuggler. And still, the Krell ship had not responded with anything except weapons fire that slammed into his shields with enough force to send his ship spinning, and alarms blaring, and his crew scrambling to their battle stations as they realized this was not a drill or a misunderstanding, but a real attack by a real enemy who intended to destroy them. Jake's ship was smaller than the Krell warship, but it was faster and more maneuverable, and his crew was well trained, and they worked together like a machine as they returned fire while Jake maneuvered to keep their most damaged shields away from the Krell guns, and he targeted the enemy weapon systems with precision strikes that disabled their main cannons without destroying the ship or killing the crew. Because even in the middle of a battle, Jake remembered his training and his duty to minimize casualties and preserve life whenever possible. even when that life belonged to someone who was trying to kill him. And after 10 minutes of intense fighting, the Krell ship was crippled and Jake's vessel had taken damage. But all his crew members were alive, though 3 of them were injured and in the medical bay being treated by the ship's doctor. Jake had transmitted a message to Council headquarters reporting the incident and requesting instructions, and then he had limped back to Zentara Prime with his damaged ship and his injured crew, and he had expected to be debriefed and perhaps commended for handling a difficult situation with minimal loss of life. But instead he found himself summoned before the full council to answer charges of provoking an interstellar incident and attacking a diplomatic vessel without cause, and violating council regulations regarding the use of force and a dozen other accusations that made no sense, because none of them matched what had actually happened out there in the darkness between the stars where he had fought for his life and the lives of his crew. Now he stood in this chamber and listened to Vexthor describe him as a warmonger and a liar, and a dangerous example of why humans should never have been admitted to the council in the first place. And Jake felt his jaw tighten and his hands clench behind his back, but he kept his face calm and his voice steady when he spoke, because losing his temper would only prove Vexthor right and give the Chancellor exactly what he wanted, which was an excuse to punish Jake and through him, punish all of humanity for the crime of being new and different and not willing to simply accept whatever the older species told them, without asking questions or demanding to be treated as equals, rather than as children who needed to be controlled and managed by their betters. Behind Vexthor sat King Aldrin IV on his throne of carved stone and precious metals, and the king was old even by the standards of his long-lived species, and his scales had faded from the bright blue of his youth to a pale silver that spoke of wisdom and age and countless years of ruling his people with justice and mercy. And Jake had heard stories about the king and how he had brought peace to this sector after centuries of war, and how he had opened the council to new species, including humanity, against the advice of counselors like Vexithor, who thought the old ways were best, and that change was dangerous, and that the galaxy should remain exactly as it had been for the past 1,000 years. Beside the king sat a younger Zentaran with scales of deep royal blue and eyes that watched everything with sharp intelligence. And this was Prince George, the king's only son and heir to the throne. And Jake had never met the prince before, but he had heard that George was different from his father in many ways, and that he spent time studying other cultures and learning their languages and customs, and that he believed the council needed to change and adapt if it was going to survive, in a galaxy that was growing more complex and more dangerous with each passing year. And as Jake stood there being accused of crimes he did not commit, he noticed that the prince was watching him with an expression that was hard to read but did not seem to contain the same contempt and anger that burned in Vexthor's eyes. Lord Chancellor Vexthor raised one clawed hand, and the murmuring voices in the council chamber fell silent as all eyes turned to watch him, and his scales rippled with colors that Jake had learned meant anger and disgust in Zentaran body language. And when the Chancellor spoke, his voice boomed through the chamber, amplified by technology that was far beyond anything humans had yet developed, and his words cut through the air like knives designed to wound and destroy, rather than to seek truth or understanding. The Krell ambassador had filed an official complaint, Vexthor announced, and his forked tongue flickered out between his teeth as he spoke. And the complaint stated that Jake's patrol vessel had violated Krell territorial waters without permission or warning and had opened fire on a peaceful diplomatic ship that was returning from negotiations with a nearby neutral system, and that Jake had destroyed critical systems and injured several Krell crew members without provocation, and that this attack represented a clear violation of council law and an act of aggression that demanded the strongest possible response to prevent further incidents and to show the Krell Empire that the council took its responsibilities seriously. Jake felt his stomach tighten as he listened to these accusations, because every single word was either a complete lie or a twisted version of the truth designed to make him look like a criminal and a warmonger, and he wanted to shout that none of this was true, and that his ship's logs would prove his innocence, but he had been warned by his lawyer that interrupting the Chancellor would only make things worse, and that he would have a chance to present his defense after Vexthor finished his accusations. So Jake stood there with his hands behind his back and his face calm, and tried not to let anyone see how angry and frustrated and afraid he was feeling. When Vexthor finally paused and asked if Jake had anything to say in response, Jake stepped forward and spoke in a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the chamber, and he said that the Chancellor's version of events was false, and that his ship's computer logs contained detailed records of everything that had happened, including sensor readings and communication attempts and damage reports. And these logs showed clearly that his vessel had been in neutral space, not Krell territory, and that he had attempted peaceful contact multiple times before the Krell ship opened fire without warning, and that he had only returned fire in self-defense after his shields failed and his crew was injured. The logs also proved that the Krell vessel was a military warship, not a diplomatic ship, and that it was heavily armed with weapons that no legitimate diplomatic vessel would carry, and that its transponder codes identified it as belonging to a Krell battle group that had been involved in several previous border incidents. And Jake finished by saying that he stood by his actions, and that any captain faced with the same situation would have responded exactly as he did to protect his ship and his crew from an unprovoked attack. Vexthor's tail slammed against the floor with a crack like thunder, and his eyes blazed with fury as he glared down at Jake and demanded to know if Jake was calling him a liar and suggesting that the sworn testimony of a Krell commander was false. And Jake met the Chancellor's gaze without flinching and said quietly that he was not calling anyone a liar, but simply stating the facts as recorded by his ship's computers, which were designed to be objective and accurate and could not be influenced by politics or personal feelings or desires to start a war. The Chancellor made a dismissive gesture with one clawed hand and announced that human technology was primitive and unreliable compared to the systems used by established species like the Zentarans and the Krell, and that human computer logs could easily be altered or falsified to show whatever the operator wanted them to show, and that everyone knew humans had a reputation for deception and trickery, going all the way back to their ancient history on Earth, where they had fought countless wars against each other using lies and propaganda and betrayal. Jake felt his face grow hot with anger at these insults, not just to himself, but to his entire species. But he forced himself to remain calm and pointed out that Council regulations required all patrol vessels to use standardized computer systems, with multiple redundancies and security protocols specifically to prevent tampering, and that his logs had been sealed and encrypted according to these regulations, and that any independent expert could verify their authenticity, and he formally requested that such an expert be appointed to examine the evidence before any judgment was made. Vexthor's response was immediate and final, and he said that the Council did not have time to waste on lengthy technical investigations when the facts were already clear, and that Jake's request was denied, and that the Council needed to act quickly to prevent this incident from escalating into a larger conflict with the Krell Empire, which was already angry about the attack and demanding both an apology and compensation for the damage to their vessel. Then Vexthor announced his proposed punishment, and Jake felt the blood drain from his face as he listened, because the Chancellor was not merely suggesting a reprimand or a suspension, but was calling for Jake to be stripped of his rank and expelled from military service with a permanent mark on his record that would make it impossible for him to ever serve in any official capacity again. And beyond that, Vexthor was proposing that Earth's entire fleet should be suspended from patrol duties, pending a full investigation into whether humans were fit to serve as council members at all. The punishment would also include massive reparations to be paid by Earth to the Krell Empire for the damage to their vessel and for the diplomatic insult of attacking one of their ships, and Vexthor suggested that these reparations should be large enough to serve as a deterrent and a lesson to humanity about the consequences of aggressive behavior, and that perhaps Earth should be required to surrender control of several strategic border outposts to neutral administration until they proved they could be trusted to act responsibly. Jake's superior officer, Commander Lisa Chang, stood among the human delegation at the side of the chamber, and her face remained carefully neutral, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her hands gripped the railing in front of her, and he knew she was just as angry as he was. But protocol required her to remain silent unless the Council asked her to testify, and so far no one had asked. Around the chamber, delegates from dozens of different species whispered to each other, and some of them looked uncomfortable with Vexthor's harsh proposals, but many others were nodding in agreement, and Jake realized with growing horror that the Chancellor might actually succeed in pushing through these punishments because humans were still outsiders here, and many of the older species resented Earth's rapid rise to prominence and would welcome any excuse to put humanity back in what they considered its proper place. The suspension of Earth's fleet would leave human colonies and trade routes vulnerable to pirate attacks and hostile forces, and there had been rumors for months that someone was organizing the pirates into larger, more dangerous groups, and that these attacks were increasing in frequency and sophistication, and some intelligence analysts suspected the Krell were behind it, testing human defenses and looking for weaknesses, and if Earth's fleet was suspended, it would be like sending an invitation for enemies to attack while humanity was defenseless. Vexthor seemed to sense victory, and his scales brightened with satisfaction as he prepared to call for a vote on his proposals, and Jake felt a wave of despair wash over him, because he knew that once the vote was called it would be over, and there would be no chance to present his evidence or to defend himself properly, and everything he had worked for, and everything his species had achieved, would be swept away by politics and prejudice and lies. But then something unexpected happened that changed everything, and gave Jake his first real hope since this nightmare began, and it came from a source he had not anticipated, because Prince George, who had been sitting silently beside his father throughout the entire proceeding, suddenly rose from his seat and spoke a single word that cut through the Chancellor's momentum like a blade through silk, and that word was wait, and every head in the chamber turned to look at the young prince as he descended the steps from the royal platform with calm, deliberate movements that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing and was not going to be intimidated or hurried by anyone. Prince George walked down the steps with his royal robes flowing behind him and his deep blue scales catching the light from the three suns overhead. And when he reached the floor of the council chamber, he did not look at Jake, but instead turned his attention to Lord Chancellor Vexthor, who stood on his elevated platform looking irritated and impatient at having his moment of triumph interrupted by someone who technically had no official authority to speak in council proceedings, but who also could not be easily dismissed because he was the king's son and heir to the throne. The prince spoke in a calm, measured voice that somehow carried to every corner of the vast chamber, without needing technological amplification, and he said that he had been listening carefully to the proceedings and that he had some concerns about the evidence that had been presented, and that he believed the council should take more time to examine all the facts before making such serious decisions that would affect not just one human captain, but the relationship between the council and an entire member species. Vexthor's tail twitched with annoyance, and he responded that the prince was young, and perhaps did not fully understand how council proceedings worked, and that matters of discipline and enforcement were traditionally handled by the chancellor's office without interference from the royal family, except in the most extreme circumstances, and that this case, while certainly important, was not extreme enough to warrant such interference, and that the evidence was clear enough that further delay would serve no useful purpose. Prince George smiled slightly and said that perhaps his youth gave him a fresh perspective on matters that others might have stopped questioning long ago. And then he did something that surprised everyone in the chamber by producing a data crystal from within his robes and holding it up for all to see. And he explained that he had taken the liberty of reviewing the evidence that Vexthor had submitted to the council, and that he had found some interesting details that he thought everyone should know about before voting. The chancellor's scales darkened with what Jake now recognized as alarm mixed with anger, and Vexthor demanded to know where the prince had obtained that crystal and by what authority he had accessed sealed evidence. But Prince George calmly replied that as heir to the throne he had certain privileges, including access to council records, and that he had merely exercised those privileges out of curiosity and a desire to understand all aspects of a case that seemed likely to have major political consequences. Then the prince activated the crystal, and a holographic image appeared in the center of the chamber showing two ships in deep space, and one was clearly Jake's patrol vessel with its distinctive Earth registry markings, and the other was a Krell warship with its angular aggressive design and heavy weapons arrays, and the recording showed Jake's ship approaching slowly and transmitting what appeared to be communication attempts, while the Krell vessel powered up its weapons, and then suddenly opened fire without warning. But this was not the same recording that Vexthor had shown earlier, and Jake realized immediately that this was the authentic footage from his ship's external cameras, showing exactly what had really happened during the encounter. And he felt a surge of hope mixed with confusion, because he did not understand how the prince had obtained this recording, when Jake's own lawyers had been denied access to it by the Chancellor's office, which claimed that all evidence needed to be kept sealed until after the council made its decision. Prince George let the recording play in silence, and everyone in the chamber watched as the Krell ship fired repeatedly at Jake's vessel, while Jake's ship attempted to retreat and only returned fire after its shields began to fail. And even then, the human vessel's weapons were precisely targeted at the Krell ship's weapon systems, rather than its engines or crew compartments, and the recording clearly showed that Jake had exercised remarkable restraint and had done everything possible to avoid killing anyone even while under attack. When the recording ended, Prince George turned to face Vexthor and asked in that same calm, measured voice why this recording, which came from Captain Morrison's own ship, and which told a very different story from the one the Chancellor had presented, was not included in the evidence package that Vexthor had shown to the Council, and whether the Chancellor had perhaps made an honest mistake, or whether there was some other explanation for this rather significant omission. Vexthor's scales were now dark with rage, and his tail was lashing back and forth, striking the platform beneath his feet with loud cracks, and he said that the prince was overstepping his authority and interfering in matters that were none of his concern, and that the recording Prince George had shown was obviously the falsified human evidence that Vexthor had already explained could not be trusted because human technology was primitive and easily manipulated. But Prince George was not finished, and he pointed out several details in the recording that would have been impossible to falsify, including the precise positions of distant stars in the background and the reflection patterns on the Krell ship's hull and the timestamps that could be cross-referenced with the orbital mechanics of nearby planets. And he had clearly done his homework and knew exactly what he was talking about, and several council members who had technical backgrounds were now nodding in agreement and looking at Vexthor with suspicion. Then the prince played another recording, and this one showed the same incident, but from a different angle and with different timestamps. And this was the recording that Vexthor had shown earlier, and as Prince George froze both images side by side, the differences became obvious even to people with no technical training, because the ships were in different positions, and the star field in the background was different, and the whole thing had clearly been staged and edited to make it look like Jake had fired first when in reality he had been the one attacked. The council chamber erupted in noise as delegates began talking and arguing and demanding explanations, and Vexthor tried to restore order by shouting that this was a conspiracy to undermine his authority and that the prince was being manipulated by human sympathizers who wanted to protect their violent species from the consequences of their actions. But his words were drowned out by the growing chaos and by the angry voices of council members who felt they had been deceived. Prince George raised his hand, and the chamber gradually fell silent again, because everyone wanted to hear what he would say next, and he spoke quietly but firmly, and said that he was not accusing the Chancellor of deliberately falsifying evidence, because that would be a serious crime, but that he was deeply concerned about how such obviously flawed evidence had been presented to the Council as fact, and that he believed an independent investigation was necessary to determine where this false recording had come from and who had created it and why. He also pointed out that Captain Morrison had requested an independent technical analysis, and that this request had been denied by Chancellor Vexthor, and that this denial now seemed highly suspicious, and that any fair and just system would have granted such a reasonable request, especially when someone's career and reputation and possibly their freedom was at stake, and that the Council's integrity depended on ensuring that all evidence was properly examined and verified before making decisions that would affect the lives of so many beings. Jake stood there watching this unfold and feeling like he was in some kind of dream, because just minutes ago he had been certain that his career was over and that humanity would be humiliated and weakened. And now suddenly, the situation had completely reversed, and it was Vexthor who was on the defensive, trying to explain away obvious inconsistencies in evidence that he had sworn was authentic and reliable. Commander Chang caught Jake's eye from across the chamber and gave him a tiny nod that said she was just as surprised and relieved as he was, but also warning him not to celebrate yet because the battle was not over. And Vexthor was a skilled politician who had survived in his position for 50 years by being clever and ruthless, and who would not go down without a fight. And indeed, Vexthor was already recovering his composure and preparing a counterattack, and his eyes gleamed with cold calculation as he turned away from Prince George and looked up toward the throne where King Aldrin sat watching everything with an expression that was impossible to read, and Vexthor's next words were directed not at the prince or at Jake, but at the king himself, and they were chosen carefully to put the old monarch in a difficult position between supporting his son or supporting his chancellor of 50 years. Part 5. The independent investigation began the very next day and was conducted by a team of technical experts from 3 neutral species who had no political connections to either Earth or the Krell Empire or the Zentaran throne, and they worked with methodical precision, examining every piece of evidence and every computer log and every sensor reading and every communication record related to the incident. And they interviewed Jake and his crew members, and they even managed to interview some of the Krell crew members, though the Krell Empire was initially reluctant to allow such interviews. Jake returned to his duties while the investigation proceeded, and his crew welcomed him back with obvious relief and respect, because they had all been worried that he would be punished for doing exactly what any good captain should do when faced with an unprovoked attack, and the 3 injured crew members were recovering well in the medical bay, and they told Jake not to worry about them, and that they were proud to have served under his command during the crisis. The investigation took 3 weeks, and during that time rumors swirled through the council chambers and the diplomatic quarters and the military installations scattered across Zentara Prime. And some people said that Vexthor would be completely vindicated, and that the prince had made a terrible mistake by challenging him, and others said that Vexthor would be arrested and exiled, and that a complete restructuring of the council's administrative offices would follow. And the truth turned out to be somewhere in between, but closer to the second scenario than the first. The investigators released their final report on a morning when all 3 suns were shining brightly, and Jake was called to appear before the council again. But this time he walked into the chamber with his head high, and Commander Chang beside him. And when he saw Prince George sitting in his usual place beside the king, the prince gave him a small nod of acknowledgement that suggested everything was going to be all right. The lead investigator was a being from a species called the Velshara, who were known for their analytical minds and their complete inability to understand or participate in political games, and she stood before the council with her 4 arms folded across her chest and her compound eyes reflecting the light in strange patterns, and she spoke in a flat, emotionless voice that somehow made her words even more damning than if she had spoken with anger or passion. She said that the investigation had determined beyond any reasonable doubt that the recording presented by Lord Chancellor Vexthor was a fabrication created using sophisticated editing software and multiple source materials, and that whoever created it had considerable technical skill, but had made several critical errors, including the stellar positioning that Prince George had identified, and also inconsistencies in the light patterns and shadow angles and digital artifacts that were invisible to the naked eye but obvious to proper analytical equipment. The investigator said that Captain Morrison's logs were completely authentic and showed no signs of tampering, and that his version of events was corroborated by the testimony of his crew members and by independent sensor readings from a nearby automated monitoring station that neither side had known about, and that the Krell vessel involved in the incident was indeed a military warship and not a diplomatic vessel as claimed, and that its crew had admitted under questioning that they had initiated hostilities after receiving orders to test human response capabilities. More disturbing than the false evidence itself was the revelation of where it had come from, and the investigator explained that her team had traced the fabricated recording back to a communication network that connected Lord Chancellor Vexthor's office with a faction within the Krell military that opposed the peace treaties between the Krell Empire and the Galactic Council, and this faction had been working to create incidents that would justify renewed hostilities, and they had found in Vexthor a willing collaborator who shared their desire to marginalize humanity and drive a wedge between Earth and the established Council species. The chamber erupted in shocked voices and angry exclamations, and Jake saw Vexthor standing rigid on his platform, with his scales gone completely black and his tail motionless and his eyes staring straight ahead, as if he could make all of this disappear by simply refusing to acknowledge it. And Jake felt no triumph in seeing the Chancellor's downfall, only a kind of weary sadness that someone in such a position of trust and responsibility had betrayed everything he was supposed to stand for. The investigator continued her report and explained that the conspiracy went deeper than just one incident, and that Vexthor had been secretly communicating with the Krell faction for at least 2 years, and that he had provided them with information about Council patrol patterns and defensive capabilities, and that he had also been working to undermine Earth's reputation through carefully orchestrated incidents and propaganda campaigns, and that the attack on Jake's ship was meant to be the culmination of these efforts, providing the excuse needed to suspend Earth's fleet and reduce humanity's influence to insignificance. King Aldrin sat on his throne listening to all of this with an expression of profound sorrow, and when the investigator finished her report, he asked Vexthor if he had anything to say in his defense, and the chamber fell silent, waiting to hear what the Chancellor would say. But Vexthor remained silent for a long moment before finally speaking in a voice that sounded nothing like his usual commanding tone. He said that everything in the report was true, and that he had indeed conspired with the Krell faction, and that he had fabricated evidence, and that he had betrayed his oath of office and his duty to the Council. But he also said that he had done all of this because he truly believed it was necessary to preserve the traditional order of the galaxy and to prevent what he saw as the chaos and instability that would result from allowing young, aggressive species like humanity to gain too much power too quickly. Vexthor's voice grew stronger as he spoke, and he said that he had served the Council for 50 years and had seen species come and go, and had watched as traditions that had maintained peace for millennia were discarded in favor of new ideas that had not been tested by time, and that he had feared that humanity, with their tendency toward violence and their refusal to accept the wisdom of older species, would eventually destroy everything that the Council had built, and that he had acted out of a sincere if misguided desire to protect something he loved. Prince George stood up and spoke for the first time since the investigator's report, and he said that he understood Vexthor's fears, and that change was indeed frightening, especially for those who had lived through centuries of relative stability. But that fear did not justify betrayal, and that tradition without adaptation led to stagnation and death, and that the Council's strength had always come not from maintaining rigid hierarchies, but from its ability to incorporate new ideas and new species and new ways of thinking. The prince said that his father had taught him that leadership meant making hard choices, and that sometimes the hardest choice was to admit when the old ways no longer served their purpose, and to embrace change, even when that change was uncomfortable and uncertain, and that Vexthor's great failing was not that he loved tradition, but that he had allowed that love to blind him to the reality that the galaxy had evolved beyond the systems he remembered from his youth. King Aldrin finally spoke, and his voice was heavy with disappointment, and he said that Vexthor's betrayal was especially painful because it came from someone he had trusted completely and had relied upon for decades, but that personal feelings could not override the law, and that Vexthor's actions had endangered the peace and stability he claimed to be protecting, and had undermined the Council's credibility, and had nearly resulted in a grave injustice being done to an innocent being. The king pronounced sentence immediately without consulting anyone else, and he said that Vexthor was stripped of his position and all his titles and privileges, and that he was banished from Council space forever, and that he would be transported to a remote colony world where he would live out the remainder of his days in exile, and that any attempt to return to Council space or to communicate with Council officials would result in immediate arrest and imprisonment. Vexthor accepted his sentence without protest and walked out of the Council chamber with his head bowed and his tail dragging on the floor, and Jake watched him go and felt a strange mixture of relief and pity, because even though Vexthor had tried to destroy his career and his reputation, Jake could understand the fear of change and the desire to hold on to familiar patterns, even when those patterns no longer worked. Lord Chancellor Vexthor stood tall on his platform and addressed King Aldrin directly, and his voice carried the weight of 50 years of loyal service, and he said that he had always served the throne with absolute dedication, and that he had never once questioned the king's wisdom or authority, and that he had worked tirelessly to maintain order and stability in a galaxy that seemed to grow more chaotic with each passing year, and that everything he had done in this case was motivated by his deep commitment to protecting the Council and preserving the peace that had been so carefully built over centuries. He suggested that perhaps the prince in his youth and inexperience did not fully appreciate how dangerous it was to undermine the authority of Council officials and to create doubt about their judgment, because such doubts could spread quickly. and lead to chaos and disorder, as every accused person would demand endless investigations and technical analyses, and the council's ability to make swift decisions would be paralyzed by bureaucracy and legal challenges, and the whole system that had kept peace for 3,000 years would collapse under the weight of excessive caution and second-guessing. Vexthor's words were carefully chosen to make Prince George seem naive and reckless, and to suggest that supporting the prince's position would be equivalent to betraying everything the king had worked for during his 200 years of rule. And Jake could see that this was a clever political move, because it forced King Aldrin to choose between his son and his chancellor, and between the traditional way of doing things and the new approach that Prince George was advocating. The king sat on his throne in silence for a long moment, and his ancient eyes moved from his chancellor to his son, and then to Jake, and around the chamber at all the assembled delegates who were waiting to see what he would decide. And the weight of 2 centuries of experience showed in every line of his face and in the way his clawed hands gripped the arms of his throne. And Jake realized that this was one of those moments that would be remembered in history books as a turning point when decisions made by a few individuals would affect the lives of billions. Finally, King Aldrin rose from his throne, and his movement was slow and deliberate as befitted his age. But there was nothing weak or uncertain about the way he stood or the way his voice filled the chamber when he spoke. And he said that he had been listening carefully to everything that had been said, and that he had been watching the evidence that had been presented, and that he had come to some conclusions that he wished to share with the council. The king said that Lord Chancellor Vexthor had indeed served faithfully for many years, and that his contributions to the council's success could not be denied, but that faithful service did not mean blind obedience, and did not excuse errors in judgment, and certainly did not excuse the presentation of flawed evidence in a matter as serious as this one, and that while he understood the Chancellor's desire to maintain order and efficiency, these goals could not be achieved at the expense of justice and truth. He then turned his attention to Prince George and said that his son had shown wisdom beyond his years by carefully examining the evidence, and by having the courage to speak up when he saw something wrong, even though doing so meant challenging someone far more powerful and experienced, and that this kind of courage was exactly what the council needed if it was going to survive and thrive in a changing galaxy where old certainties no longer applied, and where new challenges required new ways of thinking. The king's words caused a ripple of surprise through the chamber, because everyone had expected him to support his chancellor, or at least to find some middle ground that would not offend either side. But instead, he was clearly and unambiguously supporting his son's position and acknowledging that Vexthor had made serious errors. And Jake felt his heart begin to beat faster as he realized that maybe, just maybe, he was going to walk out of this chamber with his career and his reputation intact. King Aldrin continued speaking and said that he had personally reviewed the technical evidence that Prince George had presented, and that as someone who had studied stellar navigation himself many decades ago, he could confirm that the recording presented by Vexthor contained obvious inconsistencies that should have been caught during normal review procedures, and that the fact that these inconsistencies were not caught suggested either incompetence or deliberate deception, and that neither possibility was acceptable in someone holding such an important position. He said that Captain Morrison's request for an independent technical analysis should have been granted immediately, and that the denial of this request was a serious breach of proper procedure, and that it raised troubling questions about the Chancellor's motives and judgment, and that the Council could not function properly if people in positions of authority were allowed to deny accused individuals the basic right to have evidence examined by neutral experts. Vexthor's scales had gone very dark and his tail was rigid behind him, and Jake could see that the Chancellor was struggling to control his rage and humiliation at being publicly rebuked by the king in front of the entire council. And for a moment, Jake almost felt sorry for him. But then he remembered the 3 injured crew members in his ship's medical bay, and the false accusations and the attempt to destroy not just his career, but Earth's entire relationship with the council, and his sympathy evaporated. The king then did something that shocked everyone in the chamber, including Jake, and probably including Vexthor himself, because King Aldrin descended from his throne and walked down the steps to stand beside his son on the floor of the chamber. And this was unprecedented because the king never left his elevated position during official proceedings, and his presence on the floor level meant that he was not speaking as a distant authority figure, but as an equal participant in the debate. Standing beside Prince George, the king addressed the assembled delegates and said that the council was at a crossroads, and that the decisions made today would determine what kind of organization it would be in the future, and whether it would remain true to its founding principles of justice and fairness, or whether it would become just another political body where power and influence mattered more than truth, and where the strong could abuse the weak without fear of consequences. He said that humanity was new to the council, and that many species, including his own Zentarans, had been skeptical about admitting such a young and aggressive species, but that he had supported their membership because he believed that the council needed new perspectives and new energy, and that judging an entire species by the standards and prejudices of the past was exactly the kind of thinking that led to stagnation and decline. King Aldrin said that Captain Morrison had acted exactly as any good officer would have acted when faced with an unprovoked attack, and that he had shown remarkable restraint by not destroying the Krell vessel entirely when he had the capability to do so, and that this restraint demonstrated the kind of judgment and character that the council should be encouraging rather than punishing, and that to condemn him based on false evidence would be a grave injustice that would stain the council's reputation for generations. He turned to face Vexthor directly and said that the Chancellor would cooperate fully with an independent investigation into how the false evidence was created and who was responsible for it, and that if the investigation determined that Vexthor had knowingly presented fabricated evidence to the council, then there would be serious consequences, including possible removal from office, and that no one, not even someone who had served faithfully for 50 years, was above the law or exempt from accountability. The king's voice grew softer but somehow more powerful as he said that he had not ruled for 200 years by ignoring problems or by surrounding himself with people who only told him what he wanted to hear, and that he had always tried to base his decisions on facts and evidence rather than on prejudice or politics, and that he was not about to abandon those principles now, just because it meant admitting that his trusted chancellor had made terrible mistakes. Finally, King Aldrin turned to Jake and spoke directly to him and said that the council owed him an apology for the treatment he had received, and that his actions during the incident with the Krell vessel were commendable, and that he was cleared of all charges pending the results of the independent investigation, and that he should return to his duties with the full support and confidence of the throne and the council. Jake stood at attention and saluted crisply, and said that he was honored to serve the council, and that he had only done his duty, and that he looked forward to continuing that service. And his voice was steady, but inside, he was feeling a storm of emotions, relief and gratitude and vindication, and also a growing understanding that what had happened here today was about much more than just one captain or one incident, but was about the future direction of the entire galactic court. 2 days after Vexthor's banishment, Jake stood in the observation deck of the council tower watching the ships come and go through the busy traffic lanes that surrounded Zentara Prime, and the view was spectacular, with the three suns creating complex patterns of light and shadow across the curved hulls of vessels from 100 different worlds, and he held a cup of coffee that Commander Chang had brought him, and the familiar bitter taste reminded him of home and of simpler times before. He became caught up in galactic politics and conspiracies. Commander Chang stood beside him looking out at the same view, and she was quiet for a long time before she finally spoke, and said that he had been lucky, and that if Prince George had not intervened when he did, Jake would be back on Earth right now, dishonorably discharged and blacklisted and unable to find any decent job, because nobody wanted to hire someone who had supposedly started an interstellar incident. And she said this not to make him feel worse, but to make sure he understood how close he had come to losing everything. Jake nodded and said he knew exactly how lucky he was and that he had spent the past few nights lying awake, thinking about what would have happened if the prince had remained silent and let Vexthor have his way. And the thought made him feel sick to his stomach because it was not just about him, but about all the other people who might face similar situations in the future, and who might not be lucky enough to have someone like Prince George willing to risk political capital to defend them. He asked Commander Chang why she thought the prince had done it, and what had motivated him to stand up against his father's most trusted advisor, and to challenge someone who had far more experience and political power. And she took a sip of her own coffee, and thought about the question for a while before answering. She said that some people were just built differently, and that they had a sense of right and wrong that was stronger than their sense of self-preservation, and that Prince George was apparently one of those rare individuals who would do the right thing even when it was dangerous or politically inconvenient, and that this quality was what made the difference between a good leader and a great one, and between a functioning society and a corrupt one. Jake was about to respond when the door to the observation deck opened, and both officers turned to see Prince George himself entering the room, and he approached them with the same calm confidence he had shown in the council chamber, and he nodded politely to Commander Chang before addressing Jake directly. The prince said he hoped he was not intruding, and Jake quickly set down his coffee and stood straighter. Though Prince George waved away the formality and said they were not in the council chamber now, and that he preferred to speak as equals rather than as prince and subject, and this informal approach immediately put Jake at ease, though he was still intensely curious about why the prince had sought him out. Prince George moved to the viewport and stood looking out at the traffic lanes and the stars beyond, and he said that Vex Thor's removal had created a vacancy in the position of Chancellor, and that his father was currently considering candidates to fill that role, and that this was one of the most important positions in the entire council administration, and that whoever was chosen would have enormous influence over policy and operations for decades to come. He said that the traditional approach would be to appoint another Zentran, someone from the established families who had centuries of experience and deep connections to the other senior species, and that this would be the safe choice and the one that most council members would expect, but that the prince had suggested to his father that perhaps this was an opportunity to do something different and to send a message about the council's future direction. Jake and Commander Chang exchanged glances, and Jake felt his heart start to beat faster because he had a sudden suspicion about where this conversation was going, and the implications were almost too big to comprehend, and he saw that Chang had reached the same conclusion, and her expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes were wide with surprise. Prince George turned away from the viewport to face them, and he said that he had proposed appointing a human to the chancellor position, and that this would be unprecedented and controversial, but that he believed it was exactly the kind of bold move the council needed if it was going to remain relevant in a changing galaxy, and that humanity had proven itself worthy of such trust through decades of faithful service and valuable contributions to council operations. Commander Chang was the first to find her voice, and she said carefully that such an appointment would indeed be controversial, and that many council members would resist it, and that there would be political consequences that might take years to fully manifest. And the prince smiled slightly and said that change always created resistance, and that if they only did things that were safe and comfortable, then nothing would ever improve, and the council would continue down the same path until it eventually became irrelevant. The prince said that his father had ruled for 200 years and had seen the galaxy transform in ways that would have been unimaginable when he first took the throne, and that the old ways of doing things no longer worked as well as they once did, and that the council needed voices who understood the challenges facing younger species and who could bridge the gap between ancient traditions and modern realities. He looked directly at Jake and said that the incident with the Krell warship had demonstrated remarkable qualities that were needed in leadership positions, and that Jake had shown both courage under fire and restraint in victory, and that he could have destroyed the Krell vessel completely, but had chosen instead to disable it and minimize casualties, and that this kind of judgment was rare and valuable. Jake felt uncomfortable with the praise and said that he had only been following protocol and doing what any good officer would do. But Prince George shook his head and said that protocol was one thing and character was another, and that not every captain would have maintained their composure when faced with fabricated evidence and political persecution, and that not every captain would have continued to believe in the system even when that system appeared to be working against them. The prince moved toward the door but paused before leaving and said that he had defended Jake in the council chamber because it was the right thing to do, but also because he saw in him something that the older generation sometimes forgot, and Commander Chang asked what that was, and the prince's tail swayed thoughtfully as he considered his answer. He said that humanity brought hope to the council, and that humans looked at the galaxy and saw potential instead of threats, and that they built alliances instead of dependencies, and that they adapted to new situations instead of demanding that everyone else accommodate them, and that these qualities were exactly what the council needed as it faced an uncertain future with new challenges that could not be solved using old methods. Prince George opened the door and then looked back one final time and said that the chancellor position was not the only vacancy that needed to be filled, and that the council also needed a new head of fleet operations, and that this position required someone with practical combat experience combined with diplomatic skills, and that his father would be interviewing candidates soon, and that he believed Jake would find the opportunity interesting. With those words hanging in the air, the prince departed and left Jake and Commander Chang standing alone in the observation deck, with their thoughts and their coffee, and the endless stars stretching out beyond the transparent walls, and for a long moment neither of them spoke as they tried to process what had just happened. Finally, Commander Chang broke the silence and asked if the prince had just offered Jake a promotion to the council's high command, and Jake took a deep breath and said he thought the offer was bigger than just a promotion, and that what Prince George was really offering was a chance for humanity to take its place as a full partner in the council's leadership, rather than remaining perpetual newcomers who were tolerated but never truly trusted. Chang looked at him with an expression that was hard to read and asked if he was going to accept the position, and Jake said he did not know yet, and that he needed time to think about it and to consider all the implications, because taking such a position would change his life completely and would also change how Earth was perceived by the other council species, and he wanted to make sure he was ready for that kind of responsibility. But even as he said these words, Jake knew in his heart that he would accept the position, because how could he refuse when Prince George had risked so much to defend him, and when the future of human participation in the council might depend on showing that humans were ready and willing to take on greater responsibilities, and that they deserved to be treated as equals, rather than as junior partners who needed supervision. The interview for the position of head of fleet operations took place 1 week later, in a private chamber deep within the council tower, where King Aldrin conducted his most important meetings, and the room was smaller than the main council chamber, but somehow more intimidating because of its intimacy and the weight of history that seemed to permeate every stone and beam. And Jake found himself sitting across a polished table from the king himself, while Prince George sat to his father's right, and 3 senior military advisors from different species sat along the sides. The king asked Jake many questions about his military experience and his philosophy of command, and his views on the proper role of force in diplomatic situations. And Jake answered each question as honestly and completely as he could, and tried not to let his nervousness show, even though he was acutely aware that everything he said would be analyzed and judged, and would determine not just his own future, but potentially the future of all humans serving in council positions. One of the advisors asked about the incident with the Krell warship, and wanted to know if Jake had any regrets about how he had handled the situation. And Jake thought carefully before answering, because he knew this was a critical question and that his response would reveal much about his character and judgment. He said that he regretted the injuries to his crew members and wished he could have avoided the confrontation entirely, but that given the circumstances and the information available to him at the time, he had made the best decisions he could, and that he would make the same choices again if faced with similar situations, because protecting his crew and following proper protocols were his primary responsibilities, and he would not compromise those responsibilities to avoid political complications. Prince George asked what Jake thought was the most important quality for someone leading council military operations, and Jake said without hesitation that it was judgment and the ability to understand that military force was a tool that should be used sparingly and only when other options had been exhausted, and that the goal was never to win battles but to create conditions where battles became unnecessary. The king nodded slowly and asked Jake about his views on humanity's place in the council, and whether he thought humans were ready to take on greater responsibilities. And this was perhaps the most delicate question of all, because if Jake sounded too confident, he would appear arrogant. But if he sounded uncertain, he would seem unqualified, and he needed to find exactly the right balance in his response. Jake said that humanity was still learning and still making mistakes, but that every species in the council had gone through similar growing pains, and that the question was not whether humans were perfect, but whether they were committed to improving and to learning from their errors and to working cooperatively with other species. And he believed that humanity had demonstrated that commitment repeatedly over the past 50 years, and that they were ready for greater challenges. The interview lasted for nearly 3 hours and covered dozens of topics ranging from technical details of fleet logistics to broader philosophical questions about the nature of leadership. And by the end, Jake felt mentally exhausted, but also strangely energized because he had been forced to articulate ideas and beliefs that he had never quite put into words before, and the process had clarified his own thinking about what kind of leader he wanted to be. King Aldrin stood up at the end of the interview and extended one clawed hand toward Jake in the human gesture of friendship that the king had clearly learned specifically for this occasion. And Jake shook the offered hand and felt the strange texture of scales against his skin and saw something in the old king's eyes that might have been respect or approval, or perhaps just curiosity about what this young human might accomplish if given the chance. The king said that a decision would be made within the next few days, and that Jake should continue with his normal duties in the meantime, and that regardless of the outcome, the king wanted Jake to know that his conduct during the recent crisis had been exemplary and had helped restore faith in the council's ability to deliver justice, even when powerful individuals tried to pervert it for their own purposes. Jake left the meeting feeling both hopeful and uncertain, and he returned to his ship where his crew was preparing for another routine patrol along the border regions, and he threw himself into the familiar work of checking systems and reviewing flight plans and conducting drills with his crew, and the normalcy of it all was comforting after the stress and drama of the past few weeks. 3 days later, he received a priority message requesting his immediate presence at the council tower, and his heart pounded as he made the journey from the docking bay, through the crowded corridors, and up the long spiral ramp to the administrative offices where Commander Chang was waiting for him with an expression that gave nothing away. She led him to a conference room where King Aldrin and Prince George were waiting along with several other council officials, and the moment Jake entered the room, he knew from the expressions on their faces that he had been selected and that his life was about to change in ways he could barely begin to imagine. The king formally offered him the position of head of fleet operations, with all the authority and responsibility that entailed, and explained that the position would require him to resign his current commission and accept a new rank within the Council's unified command structure, and that he would be responsible for coordinating the activities of thousands of vessels from dozens of different species across hundreds of star systems. Jake accepted the position without hesitation and took the oath of office right there in the conference room with his hand on an ancient text that contained the founding principles of the Galactic Court. And when he finished speaking the oath, everyone in the room applauded, and he saw tears in Commander Chang's eyes, though she was trying to hide them. And he realized that this moment was bigger than just his personal achievement, because it represented a breakthrough for humanity, and proof that hard work and integrity could overcome prejudice and political obstacles. The news of his appointment spread quickly through the Council's communication networks, and the reactions were mixed, with some species expressing strong support, and others raising concerns about giving such important authority to someone from such a young species. But overall, the response was more positive than Jake had dared to hope, and he received messages of congratulation from officers and officials across the galaxy, including several from species he had never even met. His parents back on Earth sent a message that was filled with pride and worry in equal measure, because they understood that their son had just accepted a position that would place him at the center of galactic politics and would make him a target for anyone who opposed humanity's rise to prominence, and they asked him to be careful and to remember where he came from, and to stay true to the values they had tried to teach him. The transition period was intense and exhausting, as Jake learned the details of his new position and met with the staff he would be supervising, and began to understand the enormous scope of responsibility he had accepted. And there were moments when he felt overwhelmed and doubted whether he was really qualified for such a role. But then he would remember standing in the council chamber facing false accusations and watching Prince George rise to defend him, and he would remind himself that if the prince believed in him, then he needed to believe in himself. His first major decision as head of fleet operations came within 2 weeks of taking office, when a border dispute erupted between two minor species in a distant sector, and both sides were mobilizing their fleets and threatening military action. And Jake had to quickly assemble a neutral peacekeeping force and position it between the two hostile groups, while simultaneously working with diplomatic teams to negotiate a settlement. He handled the crisis by applying the same principles that had guided him during the incident with the Krell warship, and he refused to be rushed into hasty decisions, and he insisted on clear communication and transparency, and he made sure that all parties understood that the Council's forces would defend themselves if attacked, but would not initiate hostilities, and his approach worked, and after several tense days, the two species agreed to binding arbitration, and the crisis was resolved, without a single shot being fired. Prince George sent him a private message after the crisis ended, and congratulated him on handling a difficult situation with the same judgment and restraint he had shown during his own trial, and the prince said that this was exactly why he had fought so hard to get Jake appointed to the position, and that the council needed leaders who understood that real strength came not from the ability to destroy enemies, but from the wisdom to avoid making enemies in the first place. 6 months passed, and Jake settled into his new role with a combination of determination and humility that earned him respect even from species that had initially opposed his appointment, and he built a reputation for fairness and competence and for always being willing to listen to different perspectives before making decisions, and the fleet operations under his command became noticeably more efficient and more responsive to emerging threats and opportunities across the council's vast territories. The Krell Empire initially tested his resolve by sending warships on aggressive patrols near council borders, and by making provocative statements about human weakness and incompetence. But Jake refused to take the bait, and instead he positioned council forces in defensive configurations that made clear they would not be intimidated, while also avoiding any actions that could be interpreted as threatening. And after several weeks of this careful dance, the Krell backed down and returned to more normal patrol patterns. One evening, Jake was working late in his office reviewing reports from various sectors, when Prince George appeared at his door without the usual entourage of guards and assistants that normally accompanied royal family members, and the prince asked if Jake had a few minutes to talk, and Jake immediately set aside his work and invited the prince to sit down. Prince George settled into a chair and looked tired in a way that made Jake realize that leadership was exhausting, regardless of whether you were a ship captain or a prince. And the two of them sat in comfortable silence for a moment before the prince spoke and said that he had been thinking about the day in the council chamber when he had first challenged Vexthor and defended Jake, and about all the consequences that had flowed from that single decision. The prince said that he sometimes wondered what would have happened if he had remained silent and let events play out according to Vexthor's plan, and whether the council would be better or worse off if things had gone differently, and Jake was surprised by this admission of doubt because the prince had always seemed so confident and certain about his choices. Jake said that he could not speak for the council, but that he could say with absolute certainty that his own life would be much worse if the prince had not intervened, and that he would probably be back on Earth working some dead-end job and trying to forget that he had once had a career he loved and a purpose that mattered, and that beyond his personal gratitude, he believed the council was better for having exposed Vexthor's corruption and for having proven that justice could still prevail, even when powerful people tried to pervert it. Prince George smiled slightly and said that Jake was being diplomatic, but that he appreciated the sentiment, and then the prince's expression grew more serious, and he said that he had actually come to discuss something important, and that he wanted Jake's honest opinion about a decision he was considering. He explained that his father was growing old even by Zentaran standards, and that there had been discussions about succession planning and about what kind of changes might be needed when the prince eventually took the throne. And one proposal that had been made was to restructure the council's administration to include more representation from newer member species and to distribute power more evenly across different factions. The prince said that some of the older council members were resisting this idea and arguing that it would destabilize the traditional power structures that had maintained peace for so long, and that they were using Jake's success as an argument against change by saying that the current system already allowed talented individuals from any species to rise to positions of authority, and therefore no structural reforms were needed. Jake listened carefully and thought about the question for a long moment before responding, and he said that in his experience individual success stories were not sufficient to address systemic problems, and that while he was grateful for the opportunity he had been given, he also recognized that he had been extraordinarily lucky, and that many other qualified people from newer species never got similar chances because they did not happen to have a prince defend them in a public forum. He said that real equity required structural changes that ensured all species had fair access to opportunities and influence, regardless of how long they had been council members, and that leadership positions should be filled based on merit and ability rather than on tradition and seniority, and that the council would be stronger if it could draw on the full range of talents and perspectives available across all its member species. Prince George nodded and said that this was exactly what he had hoped Jake would say, and that it confirmed his own instincts about the reforms that would be needed. And then he said something that surprised Jake by revealing just how much the prince had been thinking about these issues. The prince said that the incident with Vexthor had taught him an important lesson about how systems could be corrupted by well-intentioned people who convinced themselves that maintaining power and tradition was more important than serving justice, and that the only way to prevent such corruption was to build systems where power was distributed and where no single individual or faction could dominate decision-making. He said that when he eventually became king, he planned to propose major reforms, including term limits for senior positions and expanded voting rights for newer member species, and transparent oversight mechanisms that would make it much harder for anyone to do what Vexthor had done, and that he knew these proposals would face fierce resistance, but that he believed they were necessary if the council was going to survive and thrive in the centuries ahead. Jake felt honored that the prince was sharing these thoughts with him, and asked what he could do to help support these reforms. And Prince George said that the best thing Jake could do was exactly what he had been doing, which was to perform his duties with excellence and integrity, and to demonstrate through his actions that newer species were ready for greater responsibilities, and that merit-based advancement benefited everyone. The prince stood to leave, and as he walked toward the door, he paused and turned back to Jake and said that he wanted Jake to know that defending him in the council chamber had been one of the easiest decisions he had ever made, because he had seen immediately that Vexthor's accusations were unjust, and that remaining silent would have been a betrayal of everything he believed in about leadership and duty and honor. He said that the hard part had not been speaking up, but had been dealing with the political fallout afterward, and managing the expectations of people who wanted him to be either more aggressive in pushing reforms or more cautious in maintaining traditions, and that leadership was full of these kinds of difficult balancing acts where there were no perfect answers, only better and worse compromises. After the prince left, Jake sat alone in his office for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened over the past 6 months, and about how one moment of courage by Prince George had changed not just his own life, but had set in motion changes that would affect the entire council for generations to come. And he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, because he understood that he was now a symbol of something larger than himself, and that his actions would be watched and judged and used as evidence in debates about humanity's place in the galaxy. But instead of feeling crushed by this weight, Jake found that he felt energized and purposeful, because he finally understood what it meant to be part of something bigger than himself, and to have the opportunity to shape the future in meaningful ways. And he thought about all the young officers from Earth and other newer species who would follow in his footsteps, and who would have opportunities that previous generations could never have dreamed of, because people like Prince George had the courage to stand up for what was right. He looked out the window at the stars scattered across the darkness like diamonds on black velvet, and he thought about all the worlds out there, and all the beings living their lives and facing their own challenges. And he felt connected to them in a way he had never felt before, because he understood now that justice was not automatic, and that fairness did not happen by accident, but required constant effort and vigilance by people who were willing to speak up even when it was difficult or dangerous. Commander Chang stopped by his office an hour later and found him still sitting in the dark looking out at the stars, and she asked if everything was all right. And Jake smiled and said that everything was better than all right, and that he was just thinking about how lucky he was to be alive at this particular moment in history, when so much was changing and when the future seemed full of possibility. She sat down beside him and they watched the stars together in comfortable silence. And after a while she said that she was proud of him and proud of what humanity had accomplished, and proud to have played a small part in a story that she suspected would be told and retold for generations as an example of how courage and integrity could triumph over corruption and prejudice. Jake said that the real hero of the story was Prince George, who had risked his political capital and possibly his relationship with his father to defend someone he barely knew, and that this kind of courage was rare and precious, and that the galaxy was lucky to have leaders who understood that doing the right thing mattered more than maintaining